gentlemen. Thank you, Thomas. I will be as brief as I can. My apologies that inevitably, despite being in Germany, we are speaking English, but it's one of those things. Don't worry about the soccer game because England won already, and that's the one that matters. Defeating Wales. And I'm glad to know that 90% of people here want Britain to remain. Sadly, you don't have a vote, which is one of those things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we've got to and then possible implications. I mean, my answer to where we have got to, having spent nearly 9 months covering this subject, is the result looks much closer than anybody would have expected. I assumed, as I think did David Cameron, that he would go to Brussels, he would win what he called his renegotiation. He would come back and he would say, we ought to stay in. There would be many studies saying that the economy would be damaged if Britain were to leave. And we have had very many studies. The IMF, the OECD, the Bank of England, the Treasury, Oxford Economics, the Institute for Fiscal Studies. They all agree that the British economy would suffer from leaving. It's extremely hard to find any economist who believes that the British economy would benefit from leaving the European Union. And I assume that would make a difference. But it's very interesting, and I think this is really not economics, this is almost sociology. Why does this not seem to be making a difference? And I would offer you several reasons in my quick 10 minutes for why that, what I regard as a fact, does not seem to be discouraging people in Britain who want to vote to leave. The first is the simple one, which was a problem from the very beginning. The European Union seems to be in a mess. And that's been true for many years. It's been particularly true since the euro crisis began. You know more about the euro crisis here in Germany because you have to pay for it more than we do in Britain. But it looks bad. And the huge difference between 1975, when Britain last voted on this subject, and now, is that in 1975 the United Kingdom was a complete basket case. It was in a disastrous condition. Inflation, incredible to think, inflation that year was 28%. And we had just come out of a 3-day week and unemployment was extremely high. And the view then was the last thing you could afford to do was to walk out of any club, let alone the European Economic Community. And the solution to Britain's problems in the 1970s, and indeed in the 1960s when we first started to think of joining, was obviously we needed to join those people in continental Europe who were doing much better than us, particularly, but not only, West Germany. France was also doing much better than Britain, and even Italy was doing better than Britain then. And I think the perception now is that's just not true. Rightly or wrongly, and I sometimes think wrongly, people in Britain think that the British economy is doing very well and continental Europe is doing very badly. They particularly look at countries like Greece, Spain, Italy, and France. They see France on strike, which is what used to happen in Britain. They forget a little bit about the fact that Germany's not doing so badly itself, and some of the Scandinavian countries are doing well. It looks bad. On top of that, you have the refugee and asylum crisis in Europe, you have the rise of populist parties in Europe. The European Union just looks bad, and I think that psychologically that's a big reason why people in Britain are not impressed by being told that economically it would be a stupid idea to vote to leave. That was my first point. Second point is immigration, and I think immigration is something we do need to take more seriously right across Europe, and it's coming up in the United States with a word you did not mention in the introduction, either of you, the word Trump. The European elites, like the American elites, have tended to gloss over people's instinctive feelings that immigration is a problem. We have said, my newspaper among others, we keep saying immigration brings you benefits. Most of the people who come to Britain to work, including people particularly from Eastern Europe, are contributors to the national economy. They don't take money out, they don't come to collect benefits. One of Mr. Cameron's objectives was to stop them coming to collect benefits. Well, they don't do that, they come to work. They tend to be young, they don't consume health costs. they are a net benefit to the economy. But there is nevertheless a resentment, particularly in what you might call the sort of the traditional people who used to have manufacturing jobs. They feel that immigrants are coming in, they think they're taking their jobs, and they think that they are consuming public services and making it harder to get a place in your school, making it harder to get to see your doctor. The idea that public services in Britain are under immense pressure because we have so many immigrants is very deeply entrenched in the public debate. And it's being accentuated, obviously, by the Leave campaign, but also by the British newspapers who tell everyone that the reason you can't get to see a doctor and the hospitals are overwhelmed is because of migrants. It is obviously untrue, but it's a very difficult one to establish. And I think that one of the lessons of this campaign has been European leaders and the European elites need to take more seriously fears of immigration and talk to people, either to explain why it's beneficial or possibly to start thinking of ways of sometimes putting limits on immigration. So that's the second huge point. And the third point, which I think relates a little bit to that, and indeed to my original point, which is people are not impressed on the economy, is there is a general distrust of the establishment. I think what's been striking in the British debate is people have said the IMF says you're going to be worse off if you leave. And the immediate response to that is to say, first of all, the IMF gets everything wrong. They got the global financial crisis wrong. Anyway, they're all part of the establishment. They're the sort of people who believe in free trade, which is increasingly unpopular, not just in this country, but in my country as well. They say the same thing about the other institutions who all make these predictions. They were wrong in the past, and they are out of touch. And somehow or other, the feeling has spread, not only in Britain, I keep wanting to emphasise, this is not just a British phenomenon, that the elites and these international institutions are speaking for the better off, the people who have succeeded as a result of globalisation, the people who've benefited from trade liberalisation. They are not speaking for the traditional working class people whose incomes have stagnated, or the people who are less well educated and are not so well placed to benefit from competition and free trade. And I think that is another huge lesson, and it's spreading right across Europe. We've seen it in the growth of populist parties that we've mentioned, Austria being one recent example, France always being an example, and in my view also Alternative for Deutschland here in Germany. There is a feeling somehow or other that although people have been told for many years that liberalisation, free trade and globalisation are very good for us all, some people don't believe it. They think there are losers as well as winners, and they think the losers have not been compensated. So that's another huge issue that makes it very difficult for something like what I frankly would say is an elite publication like ours. When we say this is good for you, people just say you're all part of the same conspiracy. They also quite often say, well, anyway, you're funded by the EU, or you were wrong about joining the euro. In both cases, they're wrong about our publication, but that is a common thing. And then there's one final thing that I'll say about why it is proving difficult to win this referendum. And you can tell from my talking, I want to stay in the European Union. And that is that if you spend many years attacking the European Union and saying everything that goes on in Brussels is terrible. All it does is produce red tape. We didn't want Mr. Juncker to become President of the European Commission. We never wanted the treaty that was signed and ratified in 2007. And you do this as the Conservative Party, and I include in that David Cameron, have done for many years. And you even go on to say, as David Cameron said, in my view very mistakenly, last year, that if he didn't get what he wanted from this renegotiation, he would recommend that we leave the EU, because we'd be fine outside Europe. It's all a lot of nonsense about red tape and so on. If you do all those things, it is very difficult in only 4 months to persuade people that actually membership of the European Union is absolutely crucial for us, and that if we left it would be a complete disaster. So it doesn't surprise me completely that the Conservative government has got itself into a bit of a mess, not helped by the fact that no fewer than 6 of David Cameron's cabinet ministers are also campaigning to leave. So you've got this rather extraordinary spectacle all the time on British television and in the British newspapers of cabinet ministers from the same party attacking their own prime minister and saying he's got it all wrong, he's wrong on migration, he's wrong on the economy and so on. And this sight of in a sense, a sort of civil war inside the Conservative Party has done Cameron no good at all, and I think it's been bad for the political climate in the country. So I think those are all reasons why it's proving very difficult. I still retain a certain amount of optimism because I think despite all that, when people come to the ballot box next Thursday, the fact that they have been repeatedly told that if you vote to leave, you will be worse off, the pound will fall by 20%, foreign holidays will be more expensive, prices will go up, I think it will make some difference. But right now, I'm not feeling terribly cheerful about the outcome because I think things could easily go wrong between now and then. And I think in terms of the way that the campaign has been conducted, there are two other features that I'll just mention very briefly before concluding on the consequences were we to leave. The two other things that are very striking, I think they would not be replicated in a country like Germany, but they are slightly peculiar to Britain. The first is that the British newspapers, I speak as a journalist, I like to think that Britain includes some of the world's best newspapers, but it clearly has some of the world's worst newspapers. If you think that Bild can be a bit over the top, you need to sample some of the British newspapers. And the press, again, quite unlike 1975, has been fairly relentlessly negative about the European Union. And it looks pretty much to me, yesterday the Sun newspaper, the biggest selling newspaper, came out and said we want to leave, and the Daily Mail, the second biggest newspaper, is about to do the same. That's going to make a big difference. In 1975, all the newspapers were in favour of staying in. Now, they are not. The second thing that is striking is that the Labour Party, the opposition Labour Party, has been extremely weak throughout this campaign. Labour is supposedly completely committed to staying in the European Union, but everybody knows the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, actually doesn't like it. He thinks it's a capitalist conspiracy, it's too liberal, it's pro-competition, it believes in free trade, all the things that Jeremy Corbyn hates as an old-fashioned, almost Stalinist type figure. So, although many of his people are campaigning vigorously to stay in, he personally is clearly not. And that is making a huge difference because many Labour voters see their party leader seemingly not being terribly enthusiastic about Europe. And many Labour voters are precisely the people who think that they have lost out from globalisation, that globalisation is responsible for the decline of the steel industry. And again, many of them are worried about immigration. So that's been a huge problem. I'll just finish then with two comments on consequences. As Thomas said, I do think that the consequences for the European Union of Brexit would be really rather serious. I think it would unbalance the Union, it would weaken it in international terms, it would be greeted as a great triumph by Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. So I think Europe would have a serious problem on its hands. I happen to think that it would be even worse for the United Kingdom, but I think that it would be a mistake for anybody over here to think Europe will be fine, we can now get rid of those wretched Brits who stopped us doing the things we want to do, we can build Kern Europa and go ahead to a federal Europe. Europe still has many problems, and I think this would just add to them. But I do think the problems in Britain would be even more serious. We would start with a massive political crisis because I cannot see David Cameron staying. We would have an economic crisis because we would go into recession. We don't know who would take over from David Cameron. And the Labour Party would also be in a mess. They've lost Scotland already, and now they're losing touch with Northern England. The only parties the only people who would be pleased would be the United Kingdom Independence Party and the hardcore Eurosceptics in the Tory Party. And the risk that the United Kingdom could break up is clearly present. I think it can be exaggerated, but it's clearly there. So I think a vote for Brexit would not just be bad for the economy, it would be bad for the United Kingdom. And I'm afraid to say that a vote for Remain, if it's very narrow, which it probably will be, is unlikely to solve all these problems, either because the people who nearly got to the point of winning will just say we need to go one more heave, just as in Scotland, and we'll try again, and the issue of Britain's membership of the European Union probably won't be resolved, even if we decide narrowly to remain. So my only conclusion really is that having a referendum on an issue like this is a terrible mistake.